Well, you'll see that a lot of aircraft accidents are blamed on pilot error. We're going to go through that. But I think that as an engineer, if you're here studying at MIT or you're going on to become an engineer, you have to also understand how to design systems such that they're appropriate for the user. I think user experience and user design has come up a lot in terms of making things intuitive, and you'll find that in some of the incidences that you'll read these NTSB reports, the pilot is at fault for not detecting that a light went out. So the absence of a light while there is beeping and all kinds of mayhem going on, and they're having to pull the controls and talk to several different people and have all kinds of codes going on, and they were supposed to notice that a light went out. And so some of these things are a little bit unreasonable with the workload that you have going on. And so I certainly encourage you to take this course on human factors, 16400, learn more about it, learn how you can design systems with the user in mind. And then this particular NTSB report I think is pretty cool. It basically talks about a Korean aircraft that was landing at Guam. There was an accident that occurred. A lot of it was related to fatigue and other issues, which we'll get into here. But it's a kind of a good example case study for you to walk through. And the MIT Open courseware on 16400 has more information about that as well. All right, so has anyone heard of controlled flight into terrain? A couple people. So what does that mean? Does anyone know what does controlled flight into terrain mean? Yes.
When a perfectly good plane hits the ground for a variety of reasons, probably pilot driven.
Yeah, so it's not necessarily attributed to the pilot, but that's what a lot of people like to do. It means that nothing actually broke on the airplane. That's what they mean by controlled flight. The airplane was controllable, but they flew into the ground or the water. Why was that? So it's a pretty common reason for, if you look at all the fatalities of aircraft, it's a driving cause. If you break up on some of the human factors, this is in military aviation now, the previous one was not. You look at some of the different things that have been blamed. So it talks about, decision making, which is one of the things we're going to talk about here, a procedural error. So a lot of different things that could contribute to these issues. So people tend to say pilot error, or it's the pilot's fault. I don't necessarily agree with that many times, again, as I talked about with regard to design. But in this class, we're really focusing on you as a pilot. For you to be as safe as you can possibly be, what do you need to know and what do you need to do to prevent this issue? We talked a lot about aircraft systems and how they work, but in general, those aircraft work well. They have redundant systems and they operate. So if you, as a pilot, are aware of the things that can affect you, that can affect your decision making, that can affect your body, you can make yourself and your flight experience much safer. So we're going to focus on two things. We're going to focus on the aeromedical factors, so that's like your body, some of the physiology there, and then aeronautical decision making, which also is sometimes referred to as cockpit resource management, which is part of that process. Okay, so aeromedical factors. So a little bit on just what you have to do in order to get your private pilot. You actually have to get a medical exam. That's part of the deal. And there are some regulations that you should look at in terms of what class of medical exam you need and how often you need to get it. So, what types of things affect you? We're going to go through each of these. Hypoxia and hyperventilation, what happens with your middle ear and sinus. We're going to talk about some spatial disorientation and illusions, but a lot of that was actually covered well by Oksana, and then some vision-related issues. So, hypoxia. There are actually many different types of hypoxia, and they can be caused by different things. So at high altitudes, or if there's low oxygen, that's one type. And you can see there's sometimes examples of people in like a chamber where they reduce the gas, reduce the oxygen. You kind of get a sense for what that is. But you can also get it from a couple other effects. So what happens if you get hypoxia? Well, impaired judgment. That's really bad if you're trying to fly an airplane and trying to make some decisions. it can actually make it difficult for you to see certain things, your reaction time. So a lot of these things, as you can imagine, would be really bad if you're in charge of flying an airplane and the safety of yourself and those inside. We'll do, for time, I'm going to skip over some of the videos that we have. You can watch them on your own time. They basically, you can watch someone being affected by hypoxia and seeing what effect it has on them. So carbon monoxide poisoning is one that I mentioned is a cause of hypoxia. And why is this an issue? Why do you think this is related? Well, actually, the way a Cessna 172 heats its cabin is related to the air could, if there are issues, if there's corrosion in the pipes, it could result in the carbon monoxide off the engine coming into the cockpit. So keep in mind these symptoms and be aware of them, and then take a look at your carbon monoxide detector to see if there's an issue. In general, you have windows in your plane, you can open them. You can also declare an emergency if it's reached a serious issue. You can make a decision that you need to land.
And turn off the cabin heat too.
Exactly. So turn off the heater because that could be the source of the carbon monoxide. Okay. Again, there are different types of hypoxia. They can cause different things, but they have very similar symptoms. You need to be aware of those symptoms, what they could cause, and try to get a sense to recognize that if you're starting to feel dizzy or lightheaded, don't ignore it. Try to determine what the cause could be. Okay. And then this is another video. I'll skip over this for time that shows you what can happen. All right, hyperventilation is another thing that can happen to you. I mentioned earlier, if you panic, it could be a serious situation. Well, it can actually lead to several symptoms. I won't read them off the page, but really it can be related to your reaction to stress. So in all situations, be calm. I think a lot of people have liked, if you listen to the actual recording of Captain Sully when he's going down in the Hudson, he's very calm. He understood the situation. It was a serious situation, but he focused on what was happening at hand. In all of these situations, take a deep breath, think about what you need to do, the order in which you need to do them. If you start getting panicked, then you're actually going to reduce your ability to deal with the situation, and the situation will get worse. So the middle ear, we're going to spend a little while talking about your ear and how it works and how it affects how you understand what's going on. But in a little bit, we're kind of going to draw a picture and show you how this works. A lot of your ability to sense if you're moving or where you are, if you're unstable, is related to your sinus. Do we have anyone in the room that's a scuba diver? Any scuba divers? All right. So scuba divers know that if you have a cold or if you have something blocking your sinus systems, then it can actually impact you underground too, under the water with all the additional pressure, and that you want to continuously equalize, is what they call it. Well, it could be an issue also when you're flying up in the air. Similarly, again, you have changes in pressure. Okay. So your body uses 3 different systems to determine what your orientation is and how things are going. So there's visual, so just looking around, that you see the horizon, you see the ground, that whether or not you're moving, looking around is one of the big ones. The vestibular system is that inner ear system that I was talking about. But then there's also your skin, just how you feel, your body on the seat, if you feel like you're being pressed into the seat or not. So, spatial disorientation. So, there are a couple different things. When you're flying in, so VMC is visual meteorological conditions. So your eyes are the main thing. You're looking out the window. You can see what's outside. But in instrument conditions, which we've talked about quite a bit, you don't have all of those visual cues. Like we talked about, you could either be between cloud layers, or there could be you could be inside a cloud and not be able to see out at all. So let's talk a little bit about the vestibular system. It's kind of complicated, but I'm going to try to give you a simplified description and zoom in right in this area. So there's this tube of fluid, and there's fluid in your ear, and it kind of spins around. And you have these hair follicles And these hair follicles, what you can sense about them is when they bend over. So if fluid starts moving through this tube in a particular direction, then these little hair particles are going to bend over. And so you feel the fact that that hair follicle got bent over. The thing is, the fluid moves when you have acceleration. So a change in velocity causes that fluid to move. So for example, if you're flying straight and level and then you start turning, the fluid is going to start moving. You feel that you've started turning. But if you continue to turn in a constant bank turn, then over time, because you're not having acceleration, you're not having any change, you're in a constant velocity, you're turning, then over time, the hair follicles will straighten out. And then what happens is, so you started the turn, now you're in a constant rate turn, your hair follicles have straightened out, now you return back to straight and level. The problem is once you return back to straight and level, sometimes the fluid now has been accelerated from that change of that constant bank now that you've straightened out, and your hair follicle will move the other way. And rather than realizing that you've straightened out and you're now flying straight and level, your inner ear will tell you that you started turning the other direction. And so in order to counter that, if you just listen to your inner ear and what you feel, you might try to overcorrect. And instead of realizing that you're now straight and level, you think that you're turning and you might continue turning more. This is a big cause of issue. So shouldn't rely on your vestibular system. Another thing is your visual system again. It's advisable not to fly in low visibility situations. We're going to have a course tomorrow that focuses exclusively on night flying, but a lot of other countries don't allow you to do night flying when you only have your private pilot. They require your instrument rating in order to fly at night, whereas in the US, you're allowed to fly at night as soon as you get your private pilot. While it might be in terms of personal minimums, you might choose, hey, I prefer not to fly at night because during the day I can see the ground, I can see the horizon, and some of these effects will be less impactful. Or get your training, get your instrument rating, and really learn how to, first of all, you spend a lot of time learning about all these physiological effects, but you also learn to focus on the controls, how to trust the controls, only in certain situations that you do not trust the controls and how you troubleshoot them, and then really how not to rely on all the things happening in your inner ear system and the seat of your pants. And then the other is just to understand some of the illusions. So we're going to talk about some of those. So this is the one we just talked about while you're turning. We spent a while, Philip showed you some great videos about the Coriolis illusion. The graveyard spiral was described pretty well by Oksana, and some of the other G-forces that you feel and how that affects you, as well as inversion illusion. So we can get into these more, but I think you got a pretty good coverage of that as well. Again, we talked about these being the three systems that affect you. This is just more backup. I think that you got a pretty good coverage of the types of things that you feel on these. So why don't we focus on how do you deal with these illusions? So first is just understand that these illusions might be happening, that your body might be telling you something that you don't expect, and how do you cope with them? Also, you could get a pre-flight weather briefing to avoid flying into clouds or fog or a reduced visibility situation. The other thing that's kind of what I'm going to point out is avoid sudden head movements. This is kind of an interesting thing. But if you drop your pen and you bend over to pick it up and you come up, that motion, as we talked about with some of these gyroscopes, it can actually cause you to think a lot of things are differently happening in your airplane. Try to, connect your pen to a lanyard around your neck. Try not to have a lot of bending and moving. because some of those effects can really affect you and confuse you when you're flying. There are also a lot of visual illusions. So even if you're on a clear day and you're looking outside and you don't have any issues with your eyes, you could have some illusions. So the bottom one is showing a night illusion. So maybe there's actually a mountain in front of you and all the lights are kind of on a slope. Well, you might think that that is the horizon and try to correct yourself to fly at an angle. So some of these things could happen. So keep an eye on all of your instruments. Get a sense to make sure that you're not in a turn. Keep double checking these types of things. But don't just trust what you see out the window. I think that's pretty much what we just covered. We talked to, Philip showed you a pretty cool slide showing an icy runway that was inclined, and he was talking about the performance difference between how much runway you would take to land on a runway that was inclined in one way or the other. Well, it can also affect you from an optical illusion perspective. If the runway is tilted up or tilted down, you might think you're closer to it or farther away from it. We also discussed this illusion with regard to the width of a runway, a narrower runway or a wider runway. Again, at night, if you don't see a lot of features and you don't see the ground, sometimes you can get confused and think you're in a different place than you are. There are a lot of different things that can cause these illusions, in fact. So if there's rain on the windshield, like flying in a day like today where there's some rain, fog can also confuse people. So all of these different things, most of them are kind of encountered in the IMC, instrument meteorological conditions. You won't face a lot of them in visual flight conditions, but you might face some of the things like an artificial horizon. So maybe the weather around you is great, but in the distance there's some fogs or clouds, and they kind of happen to be at an angle, and you might try to align yourself to that. So just be aware of those types of things. The other thing you can do is just try to frequently reference your instruments. If you think you're at a particular height, if you think you're at a particular attitude being referring to the not your attitude on life, but your angle there. I'm actually going to talk about your attitude on life in a little bit with cockpit resource management. And then obviously trust some of the other external things to your aircraft as reference. Yes?
So actually, there are two lights that are clearly red, one that's clearly white, the third one is amber or orange. I thought it was just red or white.
Yeah, so this means you're a little low, and if you go a little higher, then these two will turn white and these two will be red. Yeah.
Well, the third light is red. It's just a little bit of white mixed with the red. It's not amber, right?
I mean, I'm pretty confident that this is a normal poppy where these two are red, these two are white, and this is kind of in the transition stage between red and white, so maybe you're just below the glide slope. There are some systems that I talked about earlier that do have an amber light, but I don't think this is one of them. Okay, so motion sickness. Sometimes in little airplanes you get a little bit more turbulence, or your plane's affected by turbulence a little bit more, so you might feel that bumpiness. One thing to know is you get used to it. Your body actually gets used to it. So if you felt a little motion sick in a flight, don't feel like you'll always feel that way. Your body actually acclimates to it and it kind of goes away. But if you don't fly for a long time, then you might lose that tolerance. Okay, so stress. I think we're at MIT, so we don't really need to talk about the fact that stress is bad and can affect you. All right, let's talk about fatigue. Fatigue is a serious concern. You might hear a lot about airline accidents and fatigue because especially commercial airline pilots are scheduled to fly extremely long hours. And fatigue is very bad on your ability to fly. In that example that I was talking about the Korean airliner that was flying into Guam, one of the issues was that there was a particular beacon on the ground that they were looking for. And the beacon happened to be out, but nobody knew that there was. So there was no NOTAM yet that said that the beacon was out. And so they kept looking for this beacon. And because they were fatigued, the hypothesis is that they were really overly focused on that issue. And it wasn't really the most important issue at the time. They should have been briefing their landing. They should have been focused on other things. But they were so concerned about the fact that the beacon wasn't there. Well, sometimes when you're tired, you can get distracted by things or fixated on the wrong thing. It can cause a lot of issues. And the big problem about fatigue is there's nothing you can do other than sleep to overcome it. So just try to remember that at least most of us are not commercial airline pilots. We're not required to be flying, so many hours back to back. If you're very tired, that is a reason to decide that it's not safe to fly. So just try to keep that in mind. It can affect your performance. So being fatigued from not sleeping is one thing, but you can also get kind of tired from just flying a lot, dehydration, heat stroke. A lot of pilots like to take a water bottle with them when they fly. I think it's a good habit. If you stop, make sure to rehydrate. Keep that in mind. Then there's some actual things you should not do. No alcohol, no drugs. There's actually some specific regulations around what you're allowed to have and what you're not allowed to have. So you can read these. In general, do not drink at all before you fly. It's a bad move. You're also not allowed to transport drugs. Hopefully this isn't a topic I need to spend a lot of time on. Avoid this. Okay, so this is talking a little bit more about vision. A lot of, especially VFR flight, which is what you're going to be doing when you get your private, is looking outside the airplane. Even if you're looking outside the airplane, if you're not really focused on what you're looking at, sometimes they have what they call looking without seeing. So you're just sort of not paying attention. You do want to pay attention. You're looking actively for other aircraft. So one way to encourage your ability to not just sort of zone out, but really pay attention to what you're looking at is break up the the windshield into a couple different segments, and scan this area, and then look at where you are, scan that area, then scan the next area, so that you're really focused on, is there an aircraft in that area? No. Okay, then go to the next area. Okay, so that's an active thing you can do while you're flying. Okay, so now the second half of the human factors is aeronautical decision making. I'm going to focus on these four things: so decision making, some of the hazards, risks, and personal checklists. So again, unfortunately, human factors related decision making, can really impact the accidents, the accident rate, the aircraft incidents. It's really related to this stuff. So as cool and exciting as all the other stuff was, you really have to pay attention to things that don't seem to be about the airplane, but just how you manage, how you talk to each other, how you communicate, how you decide what you're going to do. So really there needs to be a systematic approach to how you determine the best course of action. If you're just making a decision like, where do you want to go out for dinner? I kind of like Chinese, I kind of like this, and well, that's closer. You just sort of make a decision. Whereas here, you have to decide and weigh all the different pieces of information you get. Matt just went through a whole host of weather information. That's a lot of information, and you're never going to have a day where there's absolutely no cloud in the sky, the weather's completely perfect. So for every piece of information, you really have to evaluate it and weigh it and assess it. And that's what we're going to talk about, how you assess it. The other thing is your crew resource management. Phil has said a few times that it's just safer to have a co-pilot. Fly even with a friend and have them actively be doing work. So just keep in mind that you can have, even if it's not required for your aircraft, it's a good idea to have another person in the plane. You can also refer to you can talk through things if you need to. You can leverage your autopilot. You can talk to an air traffic controller if you have some issues. You don't have to be alone in all of the decision-making process. So some of the steps you can go through is first identifying and this now I don't mean the aircraft's attitude, but your own attitude, your mental thought process. Understand how you think about decisions and how you think about information. I'm going to get into specific examples. Learning how to modify your behavior, recognize and cope with stress. This is valuable outside of flying an airplane. How to assess risk and use all the information available to you. So, hazards and risks. So a hazard is actually a condition or a circumstance. It's something that actually exists, like a lightning cloud. A risk is something that could be an issue that you need to understand and determine what its impact is to you. So when we talk about an attitude, this is the type of attitude. Unfortunately, a lot of the type of people that become pilots tend to be people that are very confident and potentially could be overconfident. That's not good. It could result in an issue. So, don't be against authority. If you have a friend who's a pilot and they seem very casual about following regulations, wearing their seatbelt, doing safety checks, that's not a good thing. You shouldn't encourage it, you shouldn't go along with it, and you should not emulate it because your life is the one on the line. Being impulsive. If you're planning to do something in a particular way and then you're like, hey, why don't I do this? That's a bad thing. If you're ever flying and you're like, hey, watch this, that's a bad attitude. You don't want to be in a plane and saying, hey, watch this. So basically, this is not what a pilot is. So as much as I've referred to Top Gun, that's pretty much the epitome of what you should not do. You should not have that type of personality or attitude. You actually need to assess risk kind of mathematically. Think about it like a math problem. You're trying to establish things. So you look at two things. What is the likelihood that this is going to occur? And then what is the severity? And then how do you go about mitigating that risk? So maybe there is some kind of hazard. We just did weather. So there is a storm coming in. Well, we're not sure if the storm's coming in or not, so there's some likelihood of the storm coming in. And then how bad of a storm is it? Are we talking about a little bit of rain or some very severe thunderstorm coming in? So even if the probability is low, if it could potentially be extremely bad, then maybe that's a higher risk. If its probability is very high, but it's not really that big of an issue, then it may not be a big issue. So you have to keep that in mind. You also want to assess your own self, your own person as a pilot. So I'm safe is kind of one acronym or one way to think about all of these things. So do you have an illness? Are you taking medication? These types of things are good to just check yourself, make sure you've really considered the situation, and if you're ready to go. If you're actually very, very tired, it may not be a good decision to go flying. The PAVE checklist actually encompasses more than that. So the P, the pilot in command, that kind of is the I'm safe checklist. This is you kind of checking yourself. It also could include checking your currency, your ratings. Are you qualified and able to fly? Have you flown recently? The aircraft, are there any issues with the aircraft? Earlier we talked about required equipment in your aircraft before you're legally able to fly. But even if there are several issues with more than one issue with your aircraft that doesn't make it illegal but would make it difficult or distracting, you might want to keep that in mind. The environment, so that can include, is it a new airport that you're flying into? Are the runways particularly short? How's the weather? The E is really interesting, external pressures. Does anyone know what I'm talking about there? What might be an external pressure? Yeah.
You have to get to another airport at a particular time.
Yeah, you have to get somewhere. There's something that the pilots call get home-itis. So if you went on a trip and you really want to get home, you might choose to discount how bad the weather is because you really want to get home. And that's a problem. You need to be aware of that. You need to realize that it's impacting your decision making. Okay, I think we just covered those types of things. Okay, so another thing you can do is just think about how you assess these different things at different stages in your flight. So at the flight planning stage, you can plan ahead to make sure that you're not going to put yourself in one of these positions. Like with external pressure, don't plan a flight where you have to be back within an hour or two. That's just a bad idea. Just flat out say no, or see if you can move that appointment to later. I like to give myself a lot of leeway or really have nothing else I need to do that day. Again, we're mostly flying for fun and for the enjoyment of it, so you don't need to put these pressures on yourself. You can plan around that. Okay, and then there are a ton of resources. These chapters in particular talk about each of the two subjects we discussed. They give a lot more examples and talk in a lot more detail. And then, of course, as I mentioned, that 16400 class, the whole course is on human factors. Okay, and so the summary here is basically you may be the weakest link. So do what you can. There are actually things you can do to assess yourself, to be aware of the types of illusions or disorientations that might be happening, how to overcome them. And you are in charge of a lot of the aeronautical decision making. You're the pilot in command, so you need to assess risks methodically and in a safe and secure way.
Yeah, so just to amplify, a lot of the FAA material emphasizes that you are, always will be, and must be the single pilot. I don't know why there's that emphasis, but a lot of business jet owners, they just have a rule that if they're taking their family to the Bahamas for 2 weeks, they may single pilot their single pilot business jet, but if they're going to fly out to a 6-hour meeting and then fly back, they will always take a co-pilot, because they know that they're not going to be at their best after that meeting and they'll be preoccupied with stuff.